The colonial era brought about changes that were previously unseen in the Spanish Empire. While Spain did its best to expel an Islamic and Jewish presence within its Christian borders, the New World presented a much different scenario, where multiculturalism and intercultural mixing prospered. African slaves brought to the colonies were not only exposed to Europeans, but also to indigenous cultures that already existed in what came to be the Americas. The result was a merging of vastly different traditions and widespread racial hybridity. The Europeans seemed utterly confused by this diversity. To make sense of it all, racial categories and gender roles became firmly entrenched within societal norms. The Casta paintings provide both a visual example of how Europeans categorized society, as well as a snapshot of what life was supposedly like during the colonial era. While the Casta paintings, created by Spanish elites, were originally an attempt to weaken the power of their social inferiors, it is important to keep in mind that people of mixed and minority races were able to move up within the social hierarchy. The elites in colonial Latin America created a social structure based on ethnicity. Categories were established to identify children born of various combinations of unions. There were endless possibilities of racial groupings and potencies of blood. But skin color and other physical characteristics provided a visual means of social categorization, and white features were always seen as superior. Those with European heritage formed the upper levels of the social structure, the God-chosen leaders of society. They established laws and rules in order to control the social mobility of the subsequent races. Not every Iberian was of noble descent, but moving to the New World allowed for the upward economic mobility of many working and middle-class men. Women generally arrived later. Their presence intended to introduce Iberian cultural values, increase stability, and uphold moral responsibility among the men in the colonies. While women were seen as less powerful, they did have a significant influence on the treatment of their inferiors. Indigenous peoples were significantly affected by the arrival of Iberians. Their world was conquered, dismantled, and restructured at the will of the Spanish Empire. It's important to note that the strength of the European impact on the indigenous depended on whether they lived in developing urban centers or in the surrounding rural areas. Those in cities learned Spanish language and culture and acted as interpreters between their community and the new European and African arrivals. Some indigenous women maintained long-lasting relationships with Europeans. Others suffered from abuse by men of all races. However, the vast majority of indigenous women tended to stay within their own communities. African slaves, especially the women, were placed at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. Reputed as treacherous and vile, the Europeans justified their violent and ruthless treatment of African women, many of whom were assaulted and abused. Testimony of black women in court was seen as untrustworthy, making it difficult for them to achieve justice for the wrongs committed against them. Laws were even put in place to limit their social mobility and what they were permitted to wear. Now that we have an idea of how the three races coexisted in the colonial era, let's take a look at the Casta paintings themselves more closely. The paintings depict the historical, social, economic, and social elements of society at the time. Colloquial terms such as Spaniard, Indian, mestizo, black, mulatto, lobo, chino, and albino were used to identify different racial combinations of race, skin color, social status, gender roles, and mannerisms. The Casta paintings generally presented a tableau of 12 to 16 separate images on canvases, each depicting a man, woman, and their child. The images progress with a noticeable darkening of skin color, demonstrating the dilution of pure Spanish blood. Indeed, as the images become darker, the painter depicts people of the lowest social status who are seen as barbaric and uncivilized. In the first image, we see a European family. The furnishings in the piece reflect this family's wealth and their ability to purchase such fine items. The violin in the father's hand signifies a level of culture and taste for the finer things in life and of European culture. Violins were brought to the colonies from Europe, demonstrating the influence of European culture. The family is shown wearing exquisite clothing. The garments are tailored, cut from fine, colorful, and embellished cloth, finished with buttons and trim. The woman's pannier is stiff, keeping her upper body rigid while her sleeves are edged with lace. She's been given all the qualities of the prototypical wealthy Spanish lady. She's also adorned with small details that exhibit her elegance and wealth. The pearl choker and earrings, the beauty spot in her left temple, and the fan in her right hand. The parents are also shown wearing wigs, a sign of high-class fashion and hygiene at the time. This image demonstrates an Afro-Indio mulatto family. They are wearing colorful clothing, clearly less tailored and embellished than the previous family. This family is gathered at a table, on which there are fruits and vegetables, representing the fact that the majority of their day would have been spent cultivating and gathering these crops to be prepared for meals. The candle also represents the European influence which originated during the medieval ages in Europe. Prior to the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, fire and torches would most likely have been used as a source of light. Again, candles would have been made by the family from tallow from the renderings of animal fat, most likely from their own livestock raised. There's an element of homemade items in this image, whereas the items shown in the European image would have been bought. Unlike Spain, where cultural purification was taking place, cultural mixing became the norm in the colonies. When we hear the term mulatto, we tend to imagine someone of African and European ancestry. While this did happen, it was not the norm, simply because there were not that many Europeans in the colonies, compared to the indigenous population. During the colonial era, the term mulatto simply denoted a prescribed social position based on the fact that one of an individual's parents was African. The other parent was, in all likelihood, indigenous. So with this new notion of mulatto in mind, you can begin to imagine just how widespread the Afro-Indigenous mulatto population was. Likewise, most documented sources focus on the elite and higher classes of the colonial era. Censuses taken during this time didn't generally extend to the rural areas where most Afro-Indio mulattoes lived. Another important factor in the evolution of Afro-Indio mulattoes was the sex ratio of Africans brought to the colonies. For every 3 males, there was 1 female. As the colonial era progressed, more and more Africans became free, and I use this term loosely. Africans were brought to the colonies for one of 2 reasons, either as a slave or to serve in the military, actively furthering the Spanish conquest. Slaves were occasionally permitted to buy themselves back from their owners. This meant a lifetime's worth of indebtedness to their owner. Most never fully paid for their freedom in their lifetime and had the debt carrying over to the future generations. Slaves could also petition their owners for permission to serve in the military in exchange for their freedom, but they would still have to pay them once they completed military service. Africans in the military were typically unpaid, though they did receive an allotment of land that they could work for an income. However, a large portion of their earnings from their land would ultimately go to their former owners. Some Africans, los conquistadores negros, or the black conquistadors, were brought to the New World via Spain and Portugal, for the sole purpose of furthering the conquest in Christianity. These Africans were free at the time of their arrival and were not indebted to anyone. After their service, they'd receive an allotment of land to work for an income. Because they weren't paying for their freedom, they were able to move to urban areas and partake in more lucrative commercial endeavors that former slaves couldn't. So, as the Africans bought their freedom and settled in the rural outskirts, they began to mingle with the local indigenous population, and the Afro-Indio mulatto population boomed. Luis de Velasco, the second viceroy of New Spain, warned in a petition to the Spanish crown that Africans and individuals of mixed descent greatly outnumbered Spaniards, and that there could be a danger of insurrection. In this image, we are shown a Spanish and Indian couple outside of a typical country backdrop. The mother is dressed extravagantly in her dress and lace bodysuit and lace sleeves. Similar to the Spaniard, lace is seen as materials associated with the idea of wealth. She is also seen wearing jewelry, which is, in this image, a pearl choker and pearl earrings. The father is seen as also wearing extravagant clothing, as he looks at his son who seems to be wiping a tear or is perhaps cranky, indicating that it is time for a nap. In colonial Mexico, children would wear miniature costumes of what the adults would wear, which is what we see in this image. This image of wearing miniature costumes or continuing the fashion from child to adult can be seen as an attempt to hold on to the past and preserve the wealth and fashion in the family. Overall, we see how the presence of fashion is used to reflect racial status of the depicted individuals. Generally speaking, the Casta paintings conveyed peace and tranquility in the New World. Some, however, depict violent scenes of quarreling couples in a disorderly environment. The contrast between the peace and violence of the Casta paintings implies a hidden message. Spanish elites at the time believed that marriage between races would cause rupture and discord within society. In other words, the combination of different races would result in chaos. In most violent Casta paintings, at least one parent is shown to have a complex and untraceable ethnicity. Another prominent characteristic of violent Casta paintings is their appalling depiction of women. As I mentioned earlier, white women were thought to introduce European cultural values to increase the stability of the new settlements and uphold a moral responsibility among the men, giving them a power that threatened the traditional male prowess. In these scenes, non-white women were often associated with destruction and aggression, disrupting the family dynamic. This articulates the message that non-European women were the cause of brutality. The men had become victims of domestic abuse at the hands of women. Though uncommon, men were sometimes represented as the aggressor, however never quite to the extent of the woman. This directly correlates to the anti-feminist views shared by male elitists. Ultimately, violent Casta paintings embodied racial as well as gender-based prejudices that became popular amongst Spanish elite. The colonial era brought with it changes and challenges to European values. Through the mixing of cultures and races, a new culture evolved, outside the control of Europeans regardless of their attempts to control and curtail it. It is due to these challenges that Latin America has evolved into the diverse and unique society and culture that it is today.